Let's start this session. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this closing keynote of the MA in International Studies in Media Power and Difference at Universitat Pompeu Fabra, in case there is someone from outside. Thanks for sharing with us this very special session with Professor Lilie Chouliaraki from the London School of Economics and Political Science. For me, it's really a pleasure to have her here after several previous attempts we made and that could not bear fruit, but finally we made it, and we really appreciated having her in this closing talk of our masters, which is our last lecturing activity of this year before students deliver their final projects. So first, let me provide some practical information to all of you. This talk is being recorded, but the camera will be spot on the guest speaker, and only the lecture without the final Q&A will be uploaded in the master's website and the UPF YouTube channel. The lecture will last around 45 minutes. And after this, we will open a Q&A and comment session for the ones wanting to make any comment or raising any question to Professor Chouliaraki. You know that you can do that by raising your Zoom hand or by writing a clear short question in the chat, but we encourage that you do it directly with your own voice. And let me now provide a short profile for our guest speaker today. Lilly Tularaki is Professor of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and one of the few communication scholars focusing on the ethics and politics of communicating human suffering. In particular, she studies the complexities of communicating human suffering in the media, with a stress on 4 areas, on 4 domains, which are the places where communication is problematized. These 4 domains are disaster news, humanitarian and human rights advocacy, war and conflict reporting, and migration news. And she has actually a volume going on, will be launched on 2023, about victimhood in Western societies, and very much related to her talk today. But she's a very prolific author in this area, actually with a large list of very interesting books. Some of them we have talked about or recommended as lectures in our masters. For instance, Discourse in Late Modernity, The Spectatorship of Suffering, The Soft Power of War, The Ironic Spectator, The Routledge Handbook of Humanitarian Communication, in this way a co-edited book, or The Digital Border, Mobility, Technology and Power. Lily has also published more than 60 articles in peer-reviewed journals and edited volumes, and her work has been published in French, Italian, Portuguese, Polish, Danish, Greek, and Chinese. She is the recipient of 2 LSE Teaching Excellence Awards and of 4 international awards for her research publications. The latest of them in 2015, when she was awarded with the Outstanding Book of the Year of the International Communication Association for the Ironic Spectator book, and in 2020, when she received a Lifetime Fellowship of the International Communication Association. Today, she is going to talk about the affective politics of populist victimhood in the pandemic, a very interesting topic. And well, it's my honor to pass the floor to you, Professor Chouliaraki. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Nuria, first of all, for this lovely introduction, and also for just having me here, for inviting me and insisting that this happens. I'm so glad that, eventually we managed to do it this year. And I'm both delighted and honored to share the thoughts of my forthcoming book with you and colleagues and students. So this is a great occasion for me too. What I'm going to do as I start is maybe share my slides to begin with, right? So my starting point in this lecture is precisely the suffering, the pain, and the loss that so many hundreds of thousands of people felt, and we all witnessed so far during the COVID-19 pandemic around the world. And here I have my first slide, is actually the front page of a New York Times article back in 2020, which says where the virus is growing most. And we can see the 5 top countries that suffered most victims of the pandemic at the time, back in 2020. Brazil, Russia, Britain, and the US have something in common. They are countries with illiberal populism.
Sorry, Lily. I think perhaps it's not only, or perhaps it's only my case, but I am seeing the slide, just the half of the slide. It's only my case of the rest of the audience.
Is that better now?
Now it's
Right now.
Thank you.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Yes. No, I just moved everything around. Okay. Today, the United States is still at the top of that morbid list with around 1 million deaths. Followed by Brazil, but the UK, and these are really the 2 countries that I'm going to be focusing mostly about, the US and the UK, the Anglo-American world, if you like, is currently on the 7th place with more than 176,000 official counted deaths, with the US having more than 1 million deaths by now. So my argument here is that this suffering of the pandemic, emotionally traumatic and morally outrageous as it is, it also offers us an important opportunity to renew our critique of authoritarian populism and to ask new questions from which to criticize and to deconstruct, if you like, populist discourse. Now, there is already an abundance of scholarly critiques on populism. And let me summarize very briefly the 3 common themes in these theorizations and critiques of the field. The first one, the first major kind of tenet of theories on populism talks about populism as a political thin ideology that institutes an antagonistic division between, on the one hand, the people, and on the other hand, its enemies, whether these enemies are migrants, corrupt elites, or mainstream news. This is what really fundamentally defines populism, that particular division. And Cas Mudde is one of the kind of key people who have written about populism as a thin ideology based on this antagonism. Another group of important authors on populism focus not so much on that division as they focus on the emotions that are mobilized by populist discourse, and particularly the emotions of fear or the emotion of resentment towards the other, whichever that other happens to be, the enemy. And here Federico Finkelstein was also talking about emotions and mythologies of populism, and Nicolas de Merzis are 2 of the names that I have been influenced by. And finally, the third tenet on populist discourse is that instead of expertise and science-informed policy making, populism favors instead charismatic leaders, charismatic politics, or the cult of the leader. Then this is what Margaret Canavan refers to as a redemptive version of democracy. Now, what remains implicit in all these 3 approaches to populism, I argue, is one key idea that informs them all, namely the idea that the people in populism are always in need of defense from a threatening other. They are always in need of protection from someone who, as my LSE colleague Francisco Panizza says, is, and I here quote, deemed to oppress or exploit the people and therefore to impede its full presence. The Brexit vocabulary of taking back control, Trump's Make America Great Again, or back in 2016, his inauguration speech that promised that the forgotten will never be forgotten again, presuppose and speak to the people precisely as sufferers. Now, these are not just slogans. They are, to use Ernesto Laclau's vocabulary, the linguistic chains of equivalence and difference that constitute populist discourse as a relatively coherent, albeit unstable, political project. And within this discourse, the people of populism is always, as Michael Fursell puts it in a great book called Le Temps de la Consolation, a subject marked by loss and in need of consolation. Indeed, as another French theorist on democracy and populism, in his book, Pierre Rossin-Vallon, in his book Democratic Legitimacy, explains that the body politic of populism is, and again I quote, the community of those whose suffering has been ignored, whose histories are not taken into account. What I'm proposing here, however, is that the pandemic condition, a moment of mass and long disruption.
I think we are stuck in the first slide.
Yes, it's okay. It's okay.
Okay.
You're stuck in the first slides. It's okay. I don't have many slides. I don't want the slides to take away from what I'm saying. The second slide is coming now. The second slide is coming in a minute. So it's okay. So what I'm proposing here, however, is that the pandemic condition, a moment of mass and long-term disruption of life itself, has shaken this foundational balance or equilibrium, if you like, between the people as victims and the leader as a savior, or the cult of the leader, if you like, in ways that render populist discourse open to significant re-articulations. How did this happen? Well, it happened because even though the rhetoric of populism, its own self-description, is all about protecting the people from pain and suffering, populist rule has simultaneously subjected its own people, those it promised to defend, to record numbers of COVID deaths, as we just saw. The pandemic, in other words, we might say, gave rise to a paradox of victimhood, or as Brubaker puts it in a very insightful article on the politics of populism during the pandemic, a paradox of protectionism. Now, of course, we can easily dismiss the paradox of victimhood as the self-evident failure of populist leaders to manage a complex event like a pandemic. It's about their incompetence, it's about their hypocrisy, it's about their callousness. Perhaps we could say that, and a lot of people say it. But I would respond that this is not enough. As critical scholars, and particularly as critical scholars of discourse, I argue, we need to go beyond those self-evident truths. And we must ask the question of how, which, as I'm sure you already know by now, is the key question in discourse analysis. So these are the questions of how that I would like to draw our attention to. How was this paradox of victimhood managed in populist discourse? Which linguistic chains of equivalence were mobilized to restabilize the perspectives of the people and the leader? Who is the people of populism in pandemic times? And who are its others? Now, in order to address these questions, let me now turn to discuss the strategies, the symbolic discursive strategies through which authoritarian populism seeks to produce new meanings around the people, its others, and on pandemic victimhood. And here they are. So let me start with denial. Denial took place in the first 6 weeks since the WHO declared COVID-19 to be a global emergency in January 30th, 2020, and involved what we might call a rhetoric of trivialization. For instance, comparing COVID with flu, as Trump and Johnson did several times. And by doing that, kind of downplaying the risks of contagion and the risks of high mortality rates. Or they persisted with COVID etiquette. Right, with, you know, both of them kind of continuing to do handshakes and being in close contact, taking selfies with their, you know, their followers, their fans, their publics, as if nothing had happened. Employed at the same time as the world was witnessing the devastation of Wuhan and subsequently Bergamo, such denial lulled people into unprotected encounters with the virus and led them indeed to mass contagion and death. According to research cited at the credible magazine Time, if the first national shutdown in England had been brought in 7 days earlier, about 25 to 48,000 lives could have been saved between March and June 2020. Similarly, in the US, 54,000 fewer people could have died had cities begun locking down on March the 1st. Moving on to normalization, this strategy primarily involved in the UK the rhetoric of herd immunity, or as Boris Johnson put it, if you can't stop it, you'd better manage it. A rhetoric that fundamentally construed people as expendable. He explained, for instance, on primetime television, that his strategy for a strong Britain under COVID-19 is, and I quote, to allow the virus to pass through the entire population while keeping the most vulnerable shielded from illness. The pandemic was here presented as a force of nature, unstoppably cruising through us all and affecting the majority. The unspoken norm is that the human cost of uncontrolled viral waves should be accepted as a necessary evil so that social and economic life can go on as usual. Sorry, this is Bolsonaro shaking hands. And part of this strategy of normalization is the rhetoric of affective preemption, what you're just seeing here on the front, on this Guardian article, where Johnson again appeared to address on public television, to address the British public, warning them that they will inevitably face a massive loss of life. So he said, I will have to level with you, I have to warn you, and I quote, many families will lose loved ones before their time. And that was just a few days before the lockdown. Moving on to depersonalization, this is the symbolic strategy of erasing the face of those who fell ill and died during the pandemic. And I mean erasing both in the literal sense of their faces or names being absent from populist discourse, and in fact being reported simply as numbers. But I mainly refer to that metaphorically, if you like, in the sense that Levinas speaks of the face as a presence that demands our recognition. So the rhetorical trait of depersonalization is basically silence or the absence or invisibility, the absence of imagery. There is almost a complete absence of empathetic language or references to collective grief in the populist discourse of the pandemic. And here is one of the many examples. Here is Trump trying to present a kind of tokenistic sense of grief to the American public, saying you can never, but not managing to ultimately, you can never really come close to replacing when you've lost someone, no matter how well we do next year. I think our economy is going to be raging. It's going to be so good no matter how well those people can never ever replace somebody they love. So you can see here the kind of intertextuality on the one hand of a kind of tokenistic grief, and on the other, the kind of primary discourse that drove his public communication with the people, which was always about the economy, keeping open, getting the markets going, etc., etc. And again, within the same week, our death totals, our numbers per million are really very, very strong. We are very proud of the job we have done. And again, I don't want to spend too much time on that. Johnson was labeled as heartless at least once for his refusal to meet with bereaved families of COVID-19 victims, but also, Bolsonaro, I'm putting this up because it's such a striking example of the callousness of populist discourse, of that kind of depersonalization. What do you expect me to do? He said, as he was confronted with the question of why his country suffered such a high rate of mortality. Now, this failure to empathize is compounded in both those kind of nation states by a rather sanitized representation of COVID-related suffering beyond populist discourse, for instance, in the media. And while we all know that the media do not really show images of death or illness on our pages or screens, apart, of course, from when it concerns non-Western countries and their struggles with their death toll, the sanitization of illness in the media sustained this depersonalization of the ill and the dead in populism that led to further denial. And here I'm just putting up a really insightful quote by Julia Sonovan from the New School, talking about the US media, saying much of the struggle in this pandemic is for visibility, for coronavirus deaths and health effects to be seen, for African American suffering to be shown, for the loss of life to be recognized, and for our grief to be shared. We're publishing millions of images a day, yet we are scrambling to see the crisis. So from this perspective, the New York Times front page with 1,000 photos and names of the perished on May 23rd, 2020, can be seen as a political act that offered that missing visibility to the dead and recognized their death as a national loss that deserve to be collectively mourned. To recap so far, denial, normalization, and depersonalization trivialize the suffering of the victims, misrecognize their humanity, and deemotionalized the collective mourning among the people, particularly essential workers and ethnic minorities who, as we will see, paid the highest toll of that pandemic. Now we are here beginning to see how the victimhood paradox is negotiated in populist discourse. It is negotiated through the erasure of suffering. Instead of recognizing COVID deaths, the discourse suppressed any display of concern for those who had suffered under populist governments. Moving on to the fourth symbolic strategy of populism, unification works in tandem with the previous ones so as to reorient the discourse towards the good doers, the benefactors, if you like, or the evil perpetrators of the pandemic. And here is a slide on the benefactors. Campaigns such as Clap for Our Carers in the UK were not engineered by populist governments as such, but populist governments capitalized on them to the maximum because those campaigns did political work to elevate essential workers to the pedestal of heroes and martyrs. And in so doing, such campaigns turned the political community into a virtuous and unified population, coming together around its gratitude for its benefactors, what Paul Taggart calls the body politic as a heartland, a mythical construction of the people connected through positive emotion and devoid of political antagonism, internal political antagonism. At the same time, by calling the virus the China virus, as Trump and Bolsonaro, for instance, did, but also blaming migrants, as it happened in the UK, in Italy, and in the US, the populist discourse also turned other nation states or marginalized populations into the enemy against which the community again is established as unified and uniform. So let me offer here another brief summary of what we've just said. The four strategies of the populist discourse, denial, normalization, depersonalization, and unification, sought both to erase the victims of the pandemic and their emotions of grief and sorrow, and to focus on other actors and emotions, heroes with gratitude for them, and enemies with fear or hate or disgust or all these negative emotions that are organized around the antagonistic other of populism. Now, many have already written about the ways in which not only populist discourse, but public discourse at large mobilizes a language of war to speak about illness, and notably, for instance, Susan Sontag. All our four strategies so far confirm that observation. War discourse, like populist discourse in the pandemic, minimizes or naturalizes mass death as a necessary evil, avoids emotional language, overtly emotional language, and avoids the visibility of its dead. And so it depersonalizes victims. And finally, it unites the heartland, the homeland, around its friends and its enemies. And while we have seen many studies on the militarization of public communication during the pandemic, I would argue that in the case of studying authoritarian populist discourse, this is not enough. The COVID pandemic, a question of urgently managing contagion within the nation state, cannot be fought by means of vilifying the Chinese or any other enemy. In other words, biopolitical projects of life and death cannot be won by means of traditional geopolitical metaphors. And at this point, I would like to introduce the final symbolic strategy that I would like to talk to you about, reverse victimization, which come to reinstall a new enemy, this time within the nation and at the heart of the political community. And in doing so, to also turn the privileged subject of populism, the people as a sufferer, the people as in need of protection, at the same time as its own enemy. So reverse victimization is precisely that. We turn into the people what used to be a unified whole in populism against its external others, and the people now become the enemy. How? How did this happen? Okay, so there are two rhetorical patterns that contributed to this. The first is the tactical use of the personal responsibility language. By this, of course, I do not mean the necessary share of duties that everyone must follow to protect themselves and others within kind of robust and science-informed frameworks of public health. Rather, I refer to the ways in which authoritarian populism weaponized personal responsibility in order to vilify those it cannot protect as themselves guilty of their own misfortune. An example of this is the UK's post-lockdown guidance that the control of the virus is a matter of simply staying alert, as if controlling what they themselves call an invisible enemy can be reduced to individual acts of washing one's hands or wearing a mask, especially in the unsafe circumstances of public transport or at work or within the family, intimate context like the family. and without the support of robust state-driven measures such as test and trace systems, for example. Right, and you can see here the UK campaign in the summer of 2020, and how much it was ridiculed by the people precisely because they could see through the scam that the personal responsibility rhetoric was for them. So particularly in context of the neoliberal dismantling of public health services, such as in the UK, or of extensively privatized systems, such as the US, this rhetoric came to blame those already structurally vulnerable to the virus, essential workers, poor and marginalized communities, ethnic minorities, for their own carelessness, for their own pre-existing conditions, for their own lack of health awareness. The day after the US statistics came out, for instance, showing tremendous race disparities in death numbers between white and Black communities, and I'm going to return to that at the end of my talk, Trump's Surgeon General said at a White House briefing that communities of color needed to step up and advise them to avoid alcohol, tobacco, and drugs as ways to protect themselves from the virus. And we had similar examples in the UK. But let me just move straight away to the second rhetorical trait of reverse victimization, which has to do with a populist attachment to a discourse of freedom with respect to the pandemic. For Johnson's government in the UK, this meant that public health measures to mitigate contagion were always made in the register of an apology. He apologized. He was so very sorry that he had to, quote, infringe on people's rights, asking them to keep inside for a while so that thousands of lives could be saved. And this is what he said to them. Well, that's exactly how he was trying to announce new measures in September 2020 when cases started rising again. And he also called the day of lifting restrictions in the summer of 2021 Freedom Day. That's the discourse of freedom in relation to public health measures. In doing this, whether he said it explicitly or not, Johnson offered an empathetic nod to anti-mask and anti-lockdown protests precisely as victims of infringement upon their rights. And in fact, a large part of his party justified the kind of anti-lockdown, anti-measure discourse, whilst its sister party, the Brexit party, supported them openly. However, no other populist was more explicit in their anti-public health measures discourse than Trump. By tweeting "Liberate Michigan, liberate Minnesota, and liberate Virginia" to his 77 million followers in April 2020, Trump called for insurrection against federal leaders following public health measures and therefore, leaders of the opposition party, urging his followers to break the lockdowns of the first wave. In so doing, he amplified a narrative of reverse victimhood where mask wearing and lockdowns were, again, violations of people's individual freedom, a form of oppression and a claim to their suffering. Contrasting the silenced victimhood of racialized communities during lockdowns with the reverse victimhood of alt-right protesters, Kumarini Silva speaks precisely of this thoughtless, mundane, and here we can see Bristol Police and anti-lockdown protests in the UK. So she was talking about this thoughtless, mundane cruelty of the white Christian alt-right that emerged from a much longer history, which includes settler colonialism and slavery, and which lies at the heart of contemporary systems of value for human life. So to conclude, by looking at the strategies of pandemic communication in populist discourse, I am here offering, I hope, a different lens through which to critique authoritarian populism. By asking how the denials, displacements, erasures, and reversals of victimhood that this discourse performed at the peak of the pandemic, my analysis alerts us to the fact that the populist failure to save lives was not only a matter of bad policies, deficient tests, or fake news. Rather, from our perspective as discourse analysts, this failure is also a failure of populism's own political vocabulary. Its vocabulary of displaying concern for the sufferer, of protecting the victim when they need it most. And this mode of critique, of critiquing the populist vocabulary on its own terms from within, if you like, what we might also call an immanent critique of populism, has both theoretical and normative value. So a couple of words on these two as I kind of wrap up my talk. First of all, in terms of theory, the theoretical value, as I argue in my forthcoming book, Victimhood, the forthcoming book title is Victimhood, the Cultural Politics of Vulnerability for Columbia University Press. The focus on victimhood allows us to thematize not only itself, but also, interestingly, its twin concept, the concept of vulnerability as a productive study in the concept in the study of populism. The two concepts are twins, but at the same time, there is a crucial difference between the two. And this difference matters a great deal in the critiquing of populist discourse, and I would say public discourse in general. What is that difference? Victimhood, on the one hand, is a speech act. It's a claim to being vulnerable. It's a claim to being traumatized, a claim to being injured. And as I have shown in line, as I'm sure you have understood, with post-structuralist and performative use of populism, who is a victim ultimately is all about a politics of discourse. The victim, in other words, can easily be disarticulated and rearticulated, in our case within populist discourse itself, but also across, in discourses across the political spectrum. Now, if victimhood is a claim to suffering, is a speech act that says I'm injured, vulnerability, on the other hand, refers to the structural and biological openness to violence, which may or may not become a speech act. It may or may not enter discourse in that sense. A virus, for instance, is biological violence on the body, though in ways that always intersect with the social violence of poverty and of exclusion. A couple of examples. From March to July 2020, twice as many people died of COVID in the most deprived areas of the UK, the northwest and the northeast of England, than those in the least deprived areas. And among Black and Brown communities, mortality rates were up to 3 times higher than those of the white population. The picture was similar, if not worse, in the US, where the infection rate in the Black counties of 3 states, as a Johns Hopkins study showed, Michigan, I think, Illinois and Virginia, the ones that Trump called to liberate, so the infection rate in the Black counties of these states were more than 3-fold higher than in the predominantly white counties, while the death rate there was 6-fold higher than in the white communities. And importantly, Black women as a group were 4 times more likely to die of COVID-19 than white men. So these statistics reflect the great asymmetry between white and black populations, between rich and poor populations, in terms of what I call the structural positions of openness to violence that each group occupies in social space. Did the pain of these vulnerable communities turn into public claims to victimhood? Did we hear them protest about their suffering? I don't think so. No, we did not. Normatively then, I'm moving from theory to the kind of normative side of our theorizations. Our critique of authoritarian populism cannot be about pitching what populists said they do against what they actually do. We already know that they tell lies. We already know that they fail their people. We already know that their regimes have exhibited unthinkable cruelty. Our critique, rather, is about deconstructing their words to reveal how their uses of victimhood and the linguistic chains of equivalence and difference they build around them conceal, misrecognize, suppress the societal power relations that perpetuate structures of vulnerability and sustain hierarchies of life and death in our political communities. And from this perspective, our critique ultimately aims to also change the political vocabulary of our public debates beyond the focus of I am a victim, I'm traumatized, I'm injured. For as I have just showed, the language of victimhood is the language of the powerful. It is not the language of the expendable and ungrievable lives of the vulnerable. For them, we need a different vocabulary. And this is our task ahead, the vocabulary of justice with care. Thank you very much.